Okay, welcome to Uncensored Conservatism. This is episode number 318, and I'm continuing to look at weird Minnesota, which I find is the weirdest state politically for a lot of reasons besides, their governor. Anyway, today's Minnesota is weird story. Starts in 2016 when an organization called Feeding Our Future was founded. Now, they repeatedly applied for state grants, but were rejected amid allegations of mismanagement, abuse, and possible fraud. In fact, the allegations were so egregious that the IRS rescinded their tax-exempt status in 2020. And then COVID happened, and Governor Jazz Hands up there in Minnesota closed the schools. Oh no, how will the children get meals? Well, enter Feeding Our Future, and they again apply for grants to provide these meals to school children outside the schools. Under legal pressure, the Minnesota Department of Education was well aware of the allegations against the organization, and they delayed responding to the grant requests. So what's the scam to do? Well, they went to court claiming they were being discriminated against, ostensibly given the number of blacks and Somalis associated with the organization. The Minnesota Department of Education actually raised concerns despite the legal pressure, and in February 2021, the FBI opened an investigation into the matter. Now, Amy Bach is their leader, and she had close ties to many politicians, including Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry and State Senator Omar Fateh. Minneapolis Council member Jamal Osman's wife operated a center that ultimately received $400,000 in grants. By December 2020, the Minnesota Department of Education delayed approving grants to Feeding Our Future, and the legal action ended up before Judge John Guthman. I believe he's a Ramsey County judge. He ruled there was no basis for delaying grant payments despite the concerns of the Minnesota Department of Education. Although he did not demand payment, he said there could be consequences if the payments weren't made. And several months later, he ruled the Minnesota Department of Education was in contempt of court and ordered the state to pay a $45,500 fine to the organization. In January 2022, the FBI raided locations where these meals were being distributed, allegedly, and their headquarters, and then the organization disbanded. Officials accused Feeding Our Future of defrauding the government of over $250 million in pandemic funds. Excuse me. And in September 2022, the federal government indicted 47 officials from Feeding Our Future with fraud and other crimes, although the eventual list of defendants rose to 70 people. In 2024, the first batch of scumbags went to trial, which led to more intrigue after it was discovered that someone, a Somali woman, attempted to bribe a juror in the case. That's the picture of the bag of cash that was left at the house, $120,000. Of the original 7 defendants, 5 were found guilty and 2 were acquitted. Later, all 5 defendants in the bribery case, including one of the acquitted, pleaded guilty to bribery. In September 2024, Mohammed Ismail was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay $47 million in restitution. Yeah, fat chance on that one. Later, Amy Bach and Salim Saeed were convicted. By March 2025, of the 70 indictments, 38 pled guilty, 7 were found guilty at trial, and the remaining 25 await trial. Although $250 million was fraudulently stolen, the government could claw back only $75 million. The rest, well, luxury homes, meals, air trips, and they're hidden in offshore bank accounts that the government cannot get its hands on. What they were doing was saying they were feeding X amount of kids, like 1,800 kids, when in fact they were maybe feeding only 200 kids. It's really gross. In June 2025, two more suspects were arrested. One as they attempted to leave the country at the Minneapolis airport. And this is the gist of the whole saga, but it runs much deeper into Minnesota and Minneapolis politics. The Minnesota Department of Education is a state agency, and usually when a state agency is sued, as Feeding Our Future did here, it is the role of the state attorney general to defend that agency, and that person in Minnesota would be none other than Keith Ellison. Now, he's an interesting person, born and raised Roman Catholic, but he converted to Muslim when he was age 19 and in college. He's a close adherent of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, and various ties to, communists. This is a professor in Minnesota who actually has the Marxist press and some rather radical Islamic organizations also. Keith Ellison is a wet dream for liberals in Minnesota, and he's not afraid of playing either the race or the xenophobia card. What's his take on the scandal? He said the FBI told his office to be quiet, lest they tip off a suspect. Yet, in December 2021, Ellison met with many of the fraudsters in his office and claims that the following month is when he learned of the depth of the fraud. So the question is, why did it take the FBI to force the issue? Perhaps if the state attorney general listened to their own Department of Education's concerns, the fraud could have been nipped in the bud a lot earlier, right? But no. To Keith Ellison, a Muslim convert, surely a fellow Muslim could not commit such fraud. And 10 days after meeting with what he described as concerned constituents in December 2021, members of Feeding Our Future, at least 20 people associated with the organization, made political contributions to the Ellisons, since Keith Ellison's son, Jeremiah, shown here, sits on the Minneapolis City Council. Ellison himself raked in about $10,000 in contributions after this meeting. Yet Ellison does his best. Sergeant Schultz, I know nothing, I see nothing. Supposedly he returned some of the money, I don't know. So where was Governor Jazz Hands when this happened? Well, his story shifts with the winds. He has at various times blamed the USDA, State Judge John Guthman, and the FBI for dropping the ball. As for the USDA, he questioned why the Trump administration did not take the allegations seriously when first reported. And the reason is simple. The state of Minnesota didn't take them seriously. So I have a question for Waltz. If the IRS strips an organization of their tax-exempt status, as the Trump Treasury Department did in 2020, why are you, as governor, handing out grants to such an organization? And the reason is simple. You were afraid of the optics of denying grant funds to a largely black Somali organization. In other words, you were paralyzed by the Somalis. And that's it for today. Have a great day. More pleasant tomorrow.